The airport buzzed with the usual chaos, a mix of hurried footsteps, the robotic announcements of delayed flights, and the occasional clatter of rolling suitcases. Among the crowd, a young black girl named Mia stood quietly, clutching her boarding pass. Her eyes sparkled with excitement. This was her first time flying first class. Dressed in a simple but elegant outfit her mother had picked out, she looked every bit like a young lady about to embark on an adventure. But to the sharp eyes of the first-class gate attendant, she seemed out of place. As the boarding announcement crackled through the speakers, passengers began lining up. Maya stepped forward, her small frame dwarfed by the towering adults around her. The words "first class" on her ticket were clear, but as she approached the gate, a tall man in a crisp pilot's uniform blocked her path. "Excuse me, young lady," the pilot said, his voice cool, but edged with something that made Mia hesitate. "Are you lost? Coach boarding is that way." Mia blinked, confused. "No, sir. I'm in first class," she said, holding up her ticket. Her voice was polite, though a hint of uncertainty crept in. The pilot's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the ticket, then at her. "This must be a mistake," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. A few heads turned, curiosity sparking in their eyes. "No mistake," Maya replied, her tone firmer now. She wasn't used to being doubted, especially not like this. But the pilot wasn't convinced. "Where are your parents?" he demanded. "Did someone else buy this for you?" Before Mia could respond, an older woman standing behind her whispered to her companion, "Poor girl, probably snuck into the wrong line. They always try, don't they?" Mia's cheeks burned, not from shame, but from frustration. Why was this happening? She had every right to be here. The pilot's expression hardened. "Listen, I don't have time for this. Step aside. First-class passengers only." Mia was about to protest when a deep voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" The crowd parted slightly as a man in an impeccably tailored suit approached. His presence was commanding, his calm demeanor laced with authority. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair and a piercing gaze that seemed to take in everything at once. It was Mia's father, an unmistakable figure to those who followed the business world. Mr. Jonathan Blake wasn't just any man. He was a billionaire known for his quiet philanthropy and fierce loyalty to his family. "That's my daughter," he said, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made the pilot hesitate. "Is there a reason she's being held up?" The pilot's confidence wavered for a split second before he straightened his posture. "Sir, I was just ensuring she was in the correct boarding group. Sometimes there are misunderstandings." Jonathan's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, his expression unreadable. "Misunderstandings," he repeated, the word hanging in the air like a challenge. Mia looked up at her father, relief washing over her face. She knew he would handle this, but she also knew he wouldn't let it slide. The tension in the air was thick, and the other passengers watched. Their curiosity now mingled with unease. Some seemed to recognize Jonathan, while others simply sensed that something bigger was unfolding. Jonathan turned his gaze to the pilot, his tone calm but firm. "My daughter doesn't need to justify her place here. She belongs in first class, and she will board first class." The pilot opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say a word, Jonathan added, "Perhaps we should speak to your supervisor. I'd like to understand how often these misunderstandings happen." The murmur of the crowd grew louder, and the pilot's face paled slightly. He glanced at Mia, then at Jonathan, clearly calculating his next move. The gate attendant fidgeted nervously, sensing the situation spiraling out of control. But before anyone could act, an airport security officer approached, drawn by the growing crowd. "Is there an issue here?" he asked, looking between the pilot and Jonathan. Jonathan smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "That depends. Are passengers often questioned about their first-class tickets, or is this a special protocol?" The security officer's expression faltered, and for a moment, everything seemed to hang in suspended silence. The pilot shifted uncomfortably, the weight of Jonathan's words pressing on him. Mia clutched her father's hand, her confidence restored by his presence, but the uncertainty of what would happen next loomed over them. The tension crackled like static electricity, leaving everyone wondering, Would justice prevail, or would this moment expose an ugly truth that too often goes unchallenged? Jonathan's sharp gaze shifted from the pilot to the security officer, who now seemed unsure of how to proceed. The murmurs among the crowd grew louder, an unsettling mix of curiosity and judgment. Mia, though still holding her father's hand, felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her: confusion, frustration, and a small flicker of fear. Why was this happening? Why couldn't she just board the plane like everyone else? The pilot cleared his throat, trying to reclaim some authority. "This isn't about your daughter personally, sir. It's just a matter of standard procedure. We need to ensure that first-class tickets are being used properly. Sometimes mistakes are made." Jonathan's expression remained calm, though his voice carried a quiet intensity that silenced the murmurs around them. "Mistakes. Let me ask you something. How often are these mistakes made with children who look like my daughter?" The pilot opened his mouth, but no words came out. His hesitation was answer enough. The security officer, sensing the weight of the moment, stepped in. "Sir, maybe we can clear this up quickly. If you and your daughter could step aside, we can verify everything." Jonathan's jaw tightened, though his voice remained measured. "Step aside. My daughter has already presented her ticket. It clearly states she belongs in first class. What exactly are you verifying? Her right to be here? Or is it something else entirely?" Mia's grip on his hand tightened. She had seen her father in business meetings before, calm, unflinching, and always in control. But this felt different. This wasn't about a deal or a negotiation. This was about her, and she could feel the weight of his protective anger simmering beneath his composed exterior. The crowd around them continued to grow, passengers craning their necks to get a better view of the unfolding drama. Some looked uncomfortable, while others seemed entertained by the spectacle. A few had even started recording on their phones, the red recording icons blinking like silent witnesses. Among the onlookers was a woman in a navy blue business suit, her gaze sharp and discerning. She stepped forward, her expression firm but polite. "Excuse me," she said, addressing the security officer. "Is there an issue with this passenger? Because if not, I'd like to board." The security officer looked caught off guard. "Ma'am, we're just trying to resolve a misunderstanding." She raised an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding? It looks to me like a child with a valid first-class ticket is being questioned for no apparent reason. Are you suggesting there's some other protocol I'm unaware of?" Jonathan glanced at the woman, offering her a subtle nod of appreciation. He didn't know her, but her willingness to step in was a small reminder that not everyone turned a blind eye. The pilot, clearly flustered now, tried to regain control of the situation. "We're simply ensuring all passengers are in the correct boarding route. It's routine." The woman in the suit gave a sharp laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Routine? Funny, I fly first class frequently, and I've never seen this happen before. Not once." She turned to Jonathan. "Perhaps you should escalate this matter. The airline's management might find this incident enlightening." The pilot's face reddened, and he took a small step back. "There's no need for that. Let's just proceed." But Jonathan wasn't ready to let it go. He turned to the security officer again. "Before we move forward, I'd like to know if this is how you handle all passengers, or if my daughter's presence here made it an exception." "I think it's a fair question, don't you?" The security officer looked increasingly uncomfortable, his eyes darting between Jonathan and the pilot. "Sir, I'm just here to ensure everything runs smoothly. If there's been a misunderstanding, I'm sure the airline will address it." Jonathan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I'll make sure they address it." Mia, meanwhile, couldn't help but notice the way people were looking at her. Some seemed sympathetic, others curious, and a few downright hostile. She had never been in the center of attention like this before, and it felt suffocating. She wished they could just board the plane and leave this moment behind, but she knew her father wouldn't let it slide. As the tension thickened, another voice broke through the crowd. "What's going on here?" A man in a uniform, clearly a higher-ranking airline official, approached the scene. His name tag read Mr. Daniels, and his demeanor suggested he was used to handling difficult situations. The pilot immediately stepped forward, relief evident on his face. "Mr. Daniels, I was just ensuring this young lady was in the correct boarding group." Mr. Daniels glanced at Mia, then at Jonathan, and finally at the crowd, which had now swelled to nearly double its original size. His brow furrowed slightly as he assessed the situation. "Is there an issue with her ticket?" Mr. Daniels asked, his tone calm but firm. "No issue," Jonathan replied before the pilot could speak. "Her ticket clearly states she's in first class, yet your pilot here seems to believe she doesn't belong." Mr. Daniels' expression darkened slightly, and he turned to the pilot. "Is that true?" The pilot stammered, "I was just being cautious. It's part of our protocol." "Cautious?" Mr. Daniels repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. "Are you suggesting she doesn't belong in first class based on her appearance?" The pilot's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Mr. Daniels sighed, clearly displeased. He turned back to Jonathan and Mia, his tone apologetic. "I'm sorry for any inconvenience this has caused. There's no excuse for what happened here. You're welcome to board at your convenience." Jonathan's expression softened slightly, though the tension in his jaw remained. "Thank you," he said, his voice clipped. As Mr. Daniels gestured for them to proceed, Jonathan leaned down and whispered to Mia, "Are you okay?" Mia nodded, though she couldn't quite find the words to respond. Her father squeezed her hand reassuringly before leading her toward the boarding gate. But as they walked past the crowd, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that this moment wasn't over. The looks, the whispers, the recording phones, this wasn't something that would disappear once they boarded the plane. It was a memory she would carry, a reminder of the world she lived in and the battles her father fought to protect her. Jonathan, too, knew this wasn't the end. As they stepped onto the jet bridge, his mind was already turning. He had faced countless challenges in his life: hostile boardrooms, billion-dollar deals hanging by a thread, even public scrutiny. But nothing tested him like moments like this. Moments when he had to confront the harsh realities his daughter would face, simply for being who she was. And as they reached the plane's doorway, he resolved to do more than just ensure Maya's flight was comfortable. He would make sure this misunderstanding didn't happen to anyone else again. But for now, he focused on Mia, determined to make the rest of her journey as memorable as possible, for the right reasons. What neither of them knew was that this flight would lead to something much bigger, a story that would ripple far beyond the confines of the plane. But that would come later. For now, the tension hung in the air, unresolved and heavy, as they settled into their first-class seats. As Mia settled into her plush first-class seat, she couldn't help but glance out of the corner of her eye at the other passengers. Some avoided her gaze entirely, while others stole curious glances, their expressions hard to read. She adjusted her seatbelt, trying to focus on the novelty of the moment. The leather seat was more comfortable than anything she'd ever imagined, and the flight attendant had already offered her a refreshing drink. But the excitement she had felt earlier was gone, replaced by an uneasy feeling that lingered like a shadow. Jonathan, seated beside her, was scrolling through his phone, his expression unreadable. Mia knew her father well enough to sense when he was working through something in his mind. He wasn't one to let things go easily, especially when it came to protecting her. She wanted to tell him she was fine, that they should just forget what happened, but something held her back. Deep down, The faint she hum knew of this the wasn't airplane's just about her. engines filled the cabin as the rest of the first-class passengers trickled in. Among them was the woman in the navy blue business suit who had spoken of earlier. She offered Mia a warm smile as she passed by, taking her seat a few rows ahead. It was a small gesture, but it made Mia feel a little less alone. Meanwhile, back at the gate, the pilot was still shaken. He hadn't expected the situation to escalate the way it did, and now he was left wondering if his actions would come back to haunt him. The truth was, he had acted on instinct, a deeply ingrained bias he rarely examined. But now, with the confrontation replaying in his mind and the knowledge that Jonathan Blake wasn't just any passenger, he felt a knot of dread forming in his stomach. As the plane began taxiing down the runway, Jonathan finally set his phone aside and turned to Mia. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice soft but serious. "I'm okay," Maya said, though her tone betrayed her uncertainty. She hesitated before adding, Why did he think I didn't belong here? Jonathan's expression hardened for a moment before he softened his tone. Some people make assumptions, Mia. Assumptions that aren't fair or right. But what's important is that you know who you are and what you deserve. You don't let anyone take that from you. Mia nodded, though her father's words left her with more questions than answers. She wanted to understand, but part of her was afraid of what she might learn. As the flight leveled out, the mood in the cabin grew quieter. Passengers busied themselves with books, laptops, or the in-flight entertainment, but Jonathan couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't over. He pulled out his laptop and began typing an email, detailing the incident with precision. He wasn't just venting his frustrations, he was documenting everything, preparing for what he knew might be a long battle. In the row ahead, the woman in the business suit was also typing on her tablet. Her name was Caroline, a lawyer specializing in civil rights cases. She hadn't intended to get involved, but the incident at the gate had struck a nerve. She had seen too many instances of casual discrimination go unchecked, and this one felt like something worth pursuing. She made a mental note to connect with Jonathan after the flight. Meanwhile, in the economy cabin, a group of passengers who had witnessed the confrontation were quietly discussing what they had seen. Among them was a young journalist named Ethan, who had captured the entire interaction on his phone. He was already drafting a post in his mind, debating whether to share the video online. Ethan wasn't sure how it would be received, but he felt a responsibility to shed light on what had happened. Unbeknownst to Jonathan, Caroline, or Ethan, the airline's corporate office had already received reports about the incident. Word had spread quickly, and the company's PR team was scrambling to get ahead of what they feared could become a public relations nightmare. An internal memo had been sent, instructing employees to be prepared for potential media inquiries, while a senior executive debated whether to reach out to Jonathan directly. Back in first class, Mia tried to distract herself by watching a movie, but her mind kept drifting back to the scene at the gate. She couldn't help but wonder how different her life would be if her father weren't who he was. Would anyone have stood up for her? Would the pilot have treated her differently if she hadn't been alone? The questions weighed on her, and for the first time, she realized how much her father had shielded her from the harsh realities of the world. Jonathan noticed her distracted expression and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "every challenge we face teaches us something. It's not always fair, but it's a chance to grow stronger." Mia looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for reassurance. "But what if it keeps happening?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan's expression softened, and he gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Then we keep fighting, together." As the flight attendants began preparing for meal service, the tension in the cabin seemed to ease slightly, but beneath the surface, the ripples of what had happened continued to spread. Caroline was drafting an email to a colleague, Ethan was weighing the potential impact of his video, and the airline's corporate team was working overtime to contain the fallout. The pilot, now seated in the cockpit, was replaying the incident in his mind, grappling with the uncomfortable truth about his actions. For Mia, the journey was far from over. This flight was just the beginning of a story that would challenge her understanding of the world and her place in it. And as the plane soared through the clouds, carrying its passengers toward their destination, the seeds of change were already taking root. The hours passed slowly as the plane continued its journey. Mia tried to focus on her coloring book, but her mind kept wandering back to the incident at the gate. She replayed the pilot's words over and over in her head, trying to make sense of them. Why had he assumed she didn't belong? Was it something about her? Her age? The way she looked? Each question only made her feel more restless. Jonathan watched her from the corner of his eye. He could see the wheels turning in her mind, and it broke his heart to know that moments like these were shaping her understanding of the world. He had worked so hard to protect her innocence, to shield her from the ugliness that often came with their success and their skin color. But no matter how much he tried, there were some battles he couldn't fight for her. In the rows ahead, Caroline leaned back in her seat, her tablet resting on her lap. She had done some research during the flight, quickly discovering who Jonathan Blake was. The name carried weight, his philanthropic work, his business empire, and his reputation for standing firm in the face of injustice were all well documented. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was an opportunity, not just for him, but for a larger conversation that needed to happen. As the plane hit a pocket of turbulence, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, instructing everyone to fasten their seatbelts. Mia gripped the armrests tightly, her knuckles turning white. Jonathan reached over and placed a calming hand on hers. "It's just a little bump," he said softly. "We're safe." Mia nodded, though her nerves didn't ease entirely. She glanced out the window at the vast expanse of clouds, trying to focus on their calm, unchanging presence. But just as the turbulence settled, a commotion broke out in the economy cabin. It started with raised voices, muffled at first but growing louder with each passing second. Jonathan turned in his seat, craning his neck to see what was happening. A flight attendant hurried down the aisle, her expression tense. Maya looked at her father with wide eyes, sensing his concern. Ethan, the young journalist, was at the center of the disturbance. He had shown the video of the gate incident to a few nearby passengers, sparking a heated discussion. Some passengers were outraged, expressing their disgust at what they had witnessed. Others, however, questioned whether the video painted the full picture, their skepticism laced with undertones that made Ethan's stomach turn. "I was there," Ethan said firmly, trying to maintain his composure. "I saw how they treated that little girl. There's no excuse for it." A middle-aged man seated across the aisle scoffed. "Look, I'm not saying it was right, but maybe there was a misunderstanding. People jump to conclusions too quickly these days." Ethan shook his head, his frustration evident. "A misunderstanding? You think a billionaire's daughter with a first-class ticket just accidentally got singled out? Come on." The debate grew louder, drawing the attention of more passengers. The flight attendant, clearly overwhelmed, tried to defuse the situation. "Sir, I need you to keep your voice down," she said to Ethan. "You're disturbing the other passengers." "I'm not trying to cause trouble," Ethan replied, his voice firm but calm. "But people need to know what happened." In first class, Jonathan listened intently, his jaw tightening. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had spent years navigating the complexities of his position, wealth, power, and the expectations that came with both. But no amount of success could erase the reality of what he and Mia had faced today. Mia tugged on his sleeve, her voice small. "What's going on back there?" Jonathan hesitated, unsure of how much to share. "Someone's talking about what happened earlier," he said carefully. "It's nothing for you to worry about." But Mia wasn't convinced. "Are they mad at us?" "No," Jonathan said firmly. "No one's mad at us. Some people just don't understand. And when they don't understand, they argue. It's not about you, Mia." The commotion in the economy cabin eventually quieted down, but the tension lingered. Ethan sat back in his seat, his mind racing. He had been hesitant to post the video, but now he felt a sense of urgency. This wasn't just about one little girl or one bad experience, it was about a pattern, a story that needed to be told. Meanwhile, Caroline decided it was time to act. She stood up, walking back toward Ethan's seat. "Excuse me," she said, her tone polite but direct. "You're the one who recorded the incident earlier, aren't you?" Ethan looked up, surprised. "Yeah, I am. Why?" Caroline extended a hand. "Caroline Marks. I'm a civil rights attorney. I think we should talk." Ethan hesitated for a moment before shaking her hand. "Ethan Davis. I'm a journalist. And yeah, I think we should." As the plane continued its journey, alliances were forming and plans were being made. Jonathan remained unaware of the connections being forged in the economy cabin, his focus solely on Mia. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The world had a way of turning personal struggles into public battles, and he knew all too well how quickly things could escalate. For now, the cabin was calm, the hum of the engines filling the silence. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, one that would challenge everyone involved in ways they hadn't anticipated. And as the plane began its descent, the tension in the air was palpable, setting the stage for what was to come. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin seemed to hang heavier than the air outside. Maya looked out the window at the sprawling city below, her mind a jumble of emotions. The events of the day had left her with more questions than answers, and though her father's calm demeanor offered some comfort, she could feel the weight of unspoken worries pressing down on him. Jonathan, seated beside her, appeared lost in thought. His laptop screen had gone dark, but his hands rested on the keyboard as if ready to spring into action. He had dealt with challenges before, boardroom battles, high-stakes negotiations, and public scrutiny. But this felt different. This wasn't just about him or his business. It was about Mia, about the kind of world she was growing up in, and about the people who had the power to shape her perception of it. As the plane touched down, a voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. Please remain seated until the captain has turned off the seatbelt sign." The announcement was routine, but to Mia, it felt like the end of a long, exhausting journey. She couldn't wait to get off the plane and leave the day's events behind her. But fate had other plans. As the passengers in first class began gathering their belongings, Jonathan's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. It was an email from the airline's corporate office. The subject line read, **URGNT. Incident Review Request **. Opening it, he quickly scanned the contents. The airline was requesting a private meeting to discuss what had happened at the gate. They wanted to clarify the situation and ensure it was handled appropriately. Jonathan's lips tightened into a thin line. He had expected the airline to reach out eventually, but the timing felt calculated. They wanted to get ahead of the story, to control the narrative before it spiraled out of their hands. He didn't trust their motives, but the message confirmed what he had suspected all along: this wasn't over. Meanwhile, in the economy cabin, Ethan and Caroline were deep in conversation. Ethan had agreed to share the video with her, and they were discussing the best way to use it. Caroline believed it could be a powerful tool, but only if handled carefully. She didn't want to sensationalize the incident. She wanted to spark a meaningful conversation about systemic issues and accountability. "I think we should loop Mr. Blake in," Caroline said, glancing toward the first-class cabin. "He's at the center of this, and he deserves to have a say in how it's handled." Ethan nodded. "Agreed, but how do we approach him? I mean, it's not exactly easy to walk up to a billionaire and strike up a conversation." Caroline smiled faintly. "Leave that to me. I've dealt with high-profile clients before. The key is to focus on the common ground, the shared goal." As the plane taxied to the gate, the flight attendants prepared to open the doors. Passengers shuffled to their feet, collecting bags and stretching stiff limbs. Jonathan helped Mia with her backpack, his mind still racing as he formulated his next steps. He was determined to address the situation head-on, but he also wanted to shield Mia from any additional stress. Just as they were stepping into the jet bridge, a voice called out behind them, "Mr. Blake, wait." Jonathan turned to see Caroline hurrying toward him, her heels clicking against the floor. Ethan followed a few steps behind, clutching his phone. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Yes." Caroline extended her hand, her tone professional yet warm. "My name is Caroline Marks. I'm an attorney, and this is Ethan Davis, a journalist. We witnessed what happened at the gate earlier, and we think it's important to address it." Jonathan's expression shifted, a mix of curiosity and caution. "I appreciate your concern, but this is a private matter." "With all due respect, Mr. Blake," Caroline said gently, "it stopped being private the moment it happened in a public space. We believe this could be an opportunity to create real change, but only if it's handled the right way." Ethan stepped forward, holding up his phone. "I recorded the whole thing. I haven't shared it yet, but I think people need to see what happened. They need to know what Mia went through." Jonathan glanced down at Mia, who was clutching his hand tightly. Her wide eyes darted between the strangers and her father, clearly trying to make sense of the interaction. Jonathan crouched down to her level, his voice soft. "Mia, why don't you go wait with Angela while I talk to these folks?" "Okay." Mia hesitated, then nodded. Angela, their trusted family assistant, was waiting just outside the gate. Jonathan handed Mia off to her with a reassuring smile before turning back to Caroline and Ethan. "All right," he said, his tone firm. "Let's talk." The three of them moved to a quieter area of the terminal, away from the crowd of disembarking passengers. Caroline explained her background and her desire to use the incident as a catalyst for broader change. Ethan showed Jonathan the video, his hands shaking slightly as he held up the phone. Jonathan watched the footage in silence, his jaw tightening as the scene unfolded. Seeing the pilot's dismissive demeanor, Mia's confusion, and his own measured but firm response stirred a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, determination. When the video ended, he handed the phone back to Ethan. "This is powerful," he admitted. "But if we're going to use it, we need to do it the right way. I won't let Mia become a pawn in some media circus." Caroline nodded. "Agreed. This isn't about sensationalism. It's about accountability and progress. If we work together, we can control the narrative." Jonathan considered her words, weighing the risks and potential rewards. He knew this decision would set the tone for what came next, not just for him and Mia, but for anyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. As he stood there, the pilot walked by, his face pale and his eyes avoiding theirs. Jonathan's gaze followed him, his expression unreadable. The stakes had just been raised, and the path forward was anything but clear. But one thing was certain: this was no longer just a personal matter. It was a battle worth fighting, and Jonathan was ready to lead the charge. As Jonathan listened to Caroline and Ethan outline their plans, his mind raced with possibilities. He knew that exposing the pilot's behavior could have significant repercussions, not just for the airline but also for his own standing in the business world. Yet, the injustice Mia had faced gnawed at him, compelling him to act. "We need to ensure that this leads to real change," Caroline emphasized. "This isn't just about one incident. It's about setting a precedent and addressing systemic issues within the airline industry." Ethan nodded in agreement. "The video has already started circulating among some passengers. If we push forward, it could gain traction online, putting pressure on the airline to take responsibility." Jonathan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision before him. "I understand, but we need to handle this carefully. I don't want Mia's experience to be exploited or sensationalized. It should highlight the problem, not just serve as a viral moment." Caroline smiled reassuringly. "That's why having someone with your influence is crucial. Your involvement can steer the narrative towards meaningful dialogue and change." As they continued to discuss their strategy, the plane's final descent began, and the terminal outside buzzed with activity. The moment felt pivotal, a crossroads where their actions could either ignite a movement or be swept aside by corporate interests. Just then, Jonathan's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from his assistant. **URGNT. Meeting requested with airline CEO upon landing. His heart skipped a beat. The timing was uncanny, and he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was trying to preemptively manage the situation. "We need to go," Jonathan said abruptly, standing up. "It seems the airline wants to speak with me directly." "Let's go, Caroline, Ethan." They followed the directions to a private conference room near the arrivals area, where the airline's CEO, Richard Thompson, awaited them. Richard was a tall man with a stern demeanor, known for his no-nonsense approach to business. His presence immediately added another layer of tension to the meeting. "Mr. Blake, Ms. Marks, Mr. Davis," Richard greeted them with a firm handshake. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." Jonathan nodded curtly. "What's the purpose of this meeting, Mr. Thompson?" Richard took a seat, his expression inscrutable. "We're aware of the incident that occurred at the gate, and we want to address it directly. Our goal is to resolve this matter amicably and ensure it doesn't escalate further." Caroline leaned forward, her eyes steady. "Amicably, Mr. Thompson, denying a child her rightful seat based on her appearance is not something that can be swept under the rug. We're here to discuss accountability and the steps your airline is willing to take to prevent such incidents in the future." Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I understand your concerns. Our policies are designed to prevent misunderstandings, but clearly, something went wrong here. We are prepared to investigate the pilot's conduct and take appropriate action." Ethan interjected, his voice firm. "An investigation is a start, but public transparency is essential. People need to see that your airline is committed to addressing these issues head-on." Richard nodded slowly. "We are willing to cooperate fully. Additionally, we'd like to offer a public apology and provide compensation to Mia and your family for the distress caused." Jonathan exchanged a glance with Caroline and Ethan. While the apology and compensation were appreciated, they didn't address the deeper issues at play. "Mr. Thompson, compensation is a start, but we need to ensure this doesn't happen again. We propose a joint statement outlining the steps your airline will take to combat discrimination and bias within your staff." Richard considered this, his expression softening slightly. "That's a reasonable request. We can work on drafting a statement together and implement mandatory training programs for all our employees to address unconscious bias and discrimination." Caroline nodded approvingly. "That's a step in the right direction. Transparency is key, and working together can help foster a more inclusive environment within your airline." As the meeting progressed, it seemed like they were making headway. Jonathan felt a sense of cautious optimism. Maybe, just maybe, real change was possible. But as they concluded the meeting, an unexpected twist awaited them. Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes meeting Jonathan's with a hint of something unspoken. "There's one more thing we need to discuss. The pilot involved in the incident has a significant amount of leverage within the company. He's been with us for over a decade and holds a key position in our operations team." Jonathan frowned, sensing the underlying tension. "What are you implying, Mr. Thompson?" Richard took a deep breath. "The pilot has threatened to expose certain information about your business dealings if we proceed with any punitive actions against him. He claims to have evidence that could harm your company's reputation and your standing in the industry." Caroline and Ethan exchanged worried glances, while Jonathan felt his blood boil. This was the unexpected twist that could derail everything they had worked towards. The stakes had just been raised to an entirely new level. "We can't allow him to blackmail us," Jonathan stated firmly. "This changes everything. If he's using this incident as leverage, we need to handle it differently." Richard nodded, his expression grave. "I agree. This is no longer just about a single incident of discrimination. It's about ensuring the integrity of our operations and protecting all parties involved." Caroline stepped forward, her voice steady despite the escalating tension. "If the pilot is making threats, that's a separate issue that needs to be addressed. We can't let personal vendettas interfere with the pursuit of justice and accountability." Ethan added, "This complicates things, but it also highlights the importance of transparency. If there's corruption or coercion within the airline, it needs to be brought to light." Jonathan took a moment to collect his thoughts. "We need to expose this without allowing it to derail the progress we're trying to make. I'm willing to cooperate fully, but we need assurances that any attempts at blackmail or coercion will be handled appropriately." Richard nodded slowly. "We can arrange for an independent investigation into both the pilot's conduct and the allegations he's making against you. It's crucial that this is handled impartially to maintain trust." As the meeting drew to a close, the atmosphere remained tense but slightly more hopeful. They had addressed the immediate conflict, but the revelation of the pilot's threats introduced a new layer of complexity that none of them had anticipated. Walking out of the conference room, Jonathan felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. He glanced at Caroline and Ethan, who looked equally burdened by the new developments. Mia, now with Angela, had been quietly observing the exchange, her innocent eyes unaware of the full extent of what was happening. Just as they were about to leave, a voice called out from behind them, "Mr. Blake, Ms. Marks, Mr. Davis." They turned to see an unassuming woman approaching them, her expression calm but determined. She was an executive from the airline's PR team, someone they hadn't met before. "I'm Lisa Hart, head of public relations. I believe we need to speak further about how we handle this situation publicly." Jonathan exchanged a wary glance with Caroline. "We've already discussed the necessary steps, Lisa. What more is there to address?" Lisa sighed, her eyes flicking between them. There's more at play here than just the initial incident and the pilot's threats. There are other concerns within the company that have been brought to my attention, and we need to ensure that any public statements don't inadvertently expose deeper issues. Caroline stepped forward, her tone firm. We're here to ensure transparency and accountability. If there are additional concerns, it's in everyone's best interest to address them openly rather than let them fester behind closed doors. Lisa paused, then nodded slowly. Agreed. I'll coordinate with the investigation team to ensure that all aspects are covered comprehensively. Thank you for your cooperation. As Lisa walked away, the final twist left a lingering sense of unease. It was clear that the situation was far more intricate than they had initially realized, with underlying issues that could potentially undermine their efforts to bring about positive change. Jonathan took a deep breath, looking around at his allies. This isn't over. We've only scratched the surface. Caroline nodded, her determination unwavering. Exactly. We need to keep pushing forward, no matter what obstacles come our way. Ethan, still holding his phone, added, and we need to ensure that the truth comes out, no matter how complicated it gets. Mia, sensing the gravity of the moment, stepped forward and placed her hand on her father's arm. As they left the terminal, the city lights twinkling around them, the path ahead was fraught with challenges and uncertainties. A mix of pride and resolve in his eyes. And equality had only intensified. We're going to make new allies and adversaries emerging from the shadows. The unexpected twists had raised the stakes higher than ever, ensuring that the story was far from reaching its conclusion. But one thing was certain: their fight was just beginning, and the true climax of their journey was yet to unfold. The tension remained thick in the air, each step forward a move deeper into the heart of the conflict, leaving the audience eagerly anticipating what would happen next.